Okay, sounds good to me. Uh, uh, the uh, uh, the central positions that Shakespeare's considering in Henry V, and indeed in all his history plays, is does religion dictate politics, or does politics dictate religion? Very broadly and roughly speaking, uh, it would be the Catholic position that religion dictates politics, and it would be the Protestant position that politics dictates religion. And so this was very much at issue in the 16th and early 17th century when Shakespeare was writing. And I'm going to argue that he wrote Henry V in light of the regime of Henry VIII. That is, shadowing Shakespeare's study of English history is Henry VIII's creation of a national church, an English national church, his putting the Catholic Church in its place, as it were, and that Shakespeare was very interested in this, the importance of bringing religion under the governance of politics. And what I discovered in preparing for tonight, thanks for some prompting from my hosts, that the Old Testament figures in Shakespeare's thinking on this material, and that in many ways what he shows in Henry V is a king using an Old Testament king as his model, or for that matter, a prophet like Moses or a leader like Joshua. And in preparing for tonight, I discovered a whole series of buried or pretty evident references to the Old Testament in the play, and I'd like to elucidate those for you tonight. So let me begin with what Henry V's problem is and why it centers on the relation of religion and politics. Henry V is the fourth in a so-called tetralogy of plays Shakespeare wrote: Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. And they really constitute Shakespeare's examination of what makes for a good kingship. And he begins with a bad king, with Richard II, who's very weak as a king, does not lead his troops into battle, is very self-indulgent, and essentially fails as a monarch, but thinks that he'll always be okay because God defends a monarch. And he talks as if he could summon to battle hosts of angels to defend his rights. Well, it turns out that doesn't work when he's confronted by one of his powerful barons, Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV. He is a good general. He does know how to lead his troops into battle. And without going through all the details, eventually Henry IV backs into the kingship, has Richard II abdicate in his favor, eventually kills him. And it is Shakespeare's preliminary indication that you can't have a weak king, that a king can't just sit on his laurels. He can't assume because he's the anointed king that no one will ever challenge him, that he can just go ahead and misrule the kingdom and get away with it. And so Shakespeare gives a portrait in Henry IV of a very effective monarch in the root sense of being militarily effective. He knows how to win battles, and Shakespeare understands that as a fundamental aspect of kingship, even more so in his day than our day, although even now we need militarily effective rulers. But it was a life or death proposition in Shakespeare's day, as it was, for example, for the people of Israel in Old Testament times. And so Henry has come to the throne, but in a very shaky position. For one thing, is he has undermined the stability of the succession by becoming a usurper. he has in effect taught his fellow nobles that you can't get away with usurping the kingship if you're strong enough about it, for example, are willing to murder the monarch you depose. Moreover, Henry has inadvertently, or at least unintentionally, stripped the kingship of its sacred aura. He has shown the people that God does not automatically defend the king. He's taught his own nobles the lesson that if they're shrewd enough, they could depose him, and he's really weakened the barrier to entry for the monarchy. And so Shakespeare shows him having a very troubled reign in these two parts, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. He faces constant rebellion from ambitious nobles who feel they helped him to power, and he hasn't been good enough in rewarding them. And moreover, we see the problem of Great Britain already, that the troubles are coming from the borders of England. The Welsh are a problem under Henry IV's rule. The Scottish are a problem, and in general, Northumberland, the people in the north, all the you want Great Britain, but the king's rule begins to fray at the edges. And Henry recognizes this. He's got another problem that his son, Prince Hal, seems like a wastrel. Nobody thinks he'll make a good king. Anyway, just to reduce this to the essentials, Henry thinks the answer is a crusade. In particular, he wants a war. He wants to unite the country behind him. He gives advice to Prince Hal, busy their giddy minds with foreign quarrels. That's his instruction to him. And in particular, he thinks a crusade would be the answer, that this would restore the sacred aura to the monarchy. If he could unite the country, not just behind a war with foreign enemies, but in a holy war. And he's very disappointed that he never gets to the Holy Land. It was prophesied that he would die in Jerusalem. Turns out Jerusalem is the name of one of the rooms in the castle, the palace, and that's where he dies. Rather sad end to his crusading ambitions. And this now is the problem that his son inherits. And in fact, Shakespeare shows that Prince Hal has only been given the appearance of being truant to the throne. He's in fact used the opportunity to go out among his people, to be studying his people. He gets to know the common people in a way that neither his father nor Richard II knew. As Hal puts it at one point, I could drink with any tinker in the kingdom in his own language. They call drinking deep, dying scarlet. He's actually learned the slang of his people so he can talk to them. And you see how that pays off in Henry V, the night before the Battle of Agincourt, when he's able to talk one-to-one to the common people in his army. So he actually has been studying to be a king, precisely when it looked like he wasn't. He hangs out with a guy named Falstaff, who's a semi-criminal, but a magnificent rhetorician, and he teaches Henry a lot of the things he knows about ruling. So coming into Henry V, his problems involve the church, the nobles, the common people, the various nations he rules, and his solution will be a kind of crusade, only it will be against the French. A lot closer. So hard to get all the way to the Holy Land. But France is just across the English Channel. Moreover, the English have claims to the French throne. do remember the Norman conquest, that's 1066. Henry V descends from a line of French kings. Historically, he was the first king of England who wrote in English. The court was fully bilingual only 100 years before Henry. And so there are a lot of reasons why France was a tempting target. And Henry will use a war against France to get his nobles behind him. He will make sure that their ambitions are satisfied, that if they don't become king, at least they can become powerful and wealthy nobles fighting against the French for Henry. He will get the common people behind him. And indeed, in the play, one indications of his strategy comes in Act 2, Scene 1, when one of these low-life followers he has says, "Shall I make you two friends? We must have France together. Why the devil should we keep knives to cut one another's throats?" And there's Henry's strategy in a nutshell. His whole problem is the English are at each other's throats. They've been going through civil war. The way to end that is to convince the people, let's unite as Englishmen and unite against the French. And that's going to involve getting the common people on his side, and in particular, getting the nationalities on his side. You may have been surprised at the kind of ethnic jokes in the play, an Irishman, a Welshman, and a Scotsman coming to a bar. I mean, that's really what's going on in whole scenes of the play, but that's very thematic because what we're seeing here is the emergence of Great Britain. And Hal was Prince of Wales, and it keeps insisting as he's a Welshman. Anyway, to get this whole plan going, though, just to unite the kingdom behind him in a crusade with France, because he's going to have a war with France and he's going to give it the aspect of a holy war. To do this, he has to begin with the Catholic Church. And that's why Shakespeare begins this play with just the most extraordinary scene. I fell over the first time I read it, that it's like this backroom scene in the Vatican. Now it's not the Vatican, it's Canterbury, but seeing the church as this fully politicized entity, where essentially they're talking about doing a deal with the English monarch. Now, what is foreshadowed in this scene is Henry VIII's eventual policy against the Catholic Church in England. What we begin with is the fact of the sheer power of the Catholic Church in Europe as a whole at this time, and in England as well. A student of mine was recently writing a paper and talked about how the Catholic Church is the richest entity in England except for the monarchy. No, it's simply the richest entity in England, and it's richer than the monarchy. And it owned all these lands, it had all these monasteries, nunneries. The monasteries were in many ways the heart of commerce in England. So the church had enormous wealth. It was independent of English law. Clergymen could not be tried in English courts at this time. And it presented a real rival to authority in England. And of course, with its ties to the Vatican, it was also linked to two great Catholic forces, France and we would say Spain, although in fact Spain at this time is better thought of as the Habsburg monarchy, which at that point ruled everything, what's now Belgium, Burgundy, Spain and Portugal, parts of Italy. It was the largest political entity on earth. When we think of the Spanish Armada, yeah, it's Spanish, but it's really the Habsburg Armada. So there were so many forces that the Catholic Church could draw upon. And Shakespeare's writing, this play's probably 1599, so 10 years after the Spanish Armada, when Catholic forces had tried to retake England. And what we see in these opening scenes is that Henry has made a move in Parliament against the Catholic Church to subject it to taxes. It's still not subject to taxes, but that it really was not subject to taxes, and it owned all this land, much of it donated. This was the great power of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, that if you wanted to get yourself out of purgatory, you gave your land to the church. That's one way the church accumulated so much land. And in particular, this conversation between the bishop and the archbishop shows that this land could support knights. And indeed, this is what Henry VIII ultimately did, is he seized all the Catholic land in England, again, especially the monasteries and the nunneries, and he used them to create a new aristocracy that was directly loyal to him. He would take his tailor and make him the Duke of Sussex or something like that. And it's really interesting how what eventually became Henry VIII's policy is outlined here. It's a real threat to the church, seize their land, seize their money, and Henry V is not going to do that, but he's going to get leverage with the church, and what he needs to do is get the church to support his war against France, because from the beginning he wants to give it the aura of a religiously sanctioned moment. And here the churchmen are so perfect for this, because they know Latin, they've read the Bible, and they're very good at interpreting things. So what we begin with in this opening sequence is this interpretation showing the French that their Salic law, which they think applies to their monarchy, does not. And I'm sure the French are very surprised to hear that. That is, Henry's claim to the French throne would be through the female line. The British don't have a problem with that, but the French do. But now the Catholic Church is going to tell Henry that really he is entitled to be the King of France. And the speech is very long. In a way, it is comic. Laurence Olivier, in his film Henry V, overdoes that, but it shows that he senses there's something wrong with the speech. And if you go through this speech, I believe it mentions at least 3 usurpations. And it teaches us something about the succession of the throne. It really is not grounded in anything too substantial. That if you look at anybody's claim to the throne, there are interruptions in the sacred line, just as there was in England when Henry IV usurped the throne from Richard II. And indeed, one of the great ironies of this opening sequence is that Henry V's claim to the British throne is not very strong in itself. There are several people in this play who challenge his legitimacy, and Henry is descended from the second son of Edward III, I think it is, whereas Richard II was descended from his first son. And there are people who have claimed to the throne out of the line that began with Edward the Black Prince, who died battling in France. Anyway, just if you're confused about this, fine. That's Shakespeare's whole point. All these claims to the throne are confused, but the church is willing to give Henry what he wants. And indeed, as he says after this long speech, Henry says, "May I with right and conscience make this claim." And Canterbury says, "The sin upon my head, dread sovereign." This is a sign of Henry's continuing policy to transfer responsibility for his deeds to other people. It's very Machiavellian. It is his hope that he won't have to take the blame for what he does. And it's turned upon him later in the play when he gets his soldiers to say the same thing for him in Act 4, Scene 1, when Henry argues that the soldiers do evil in battle, it's their fault, and one of his men, "'Tis certain every man that dies ill, the ill upon his own head, the king is not to answer it." This is what Henry always does with the nobles who are rebelling against him. In the second act, he gets them to proclaim death. "Oh, if these are traitors, they should be executed." And he says, "By the way, you're the traitors, so you just condemn yourselves to death." With the town of Harfleur, he says, "Here's your choice. You can surrender the town. If you hold out, I'm going to destroy your town, and the sin will be on your head." He's always trying to transfer blame. By the way, this is one of the Old Testament quotations that is in the play. I learned this from reading a couple of really interesting articles. I got to give these guys credit. Stephen Marks, an essay called Holy War and Henry V, which I gather later became his book, Shakespeare and the Bible, and someone whose name I can barely pronounce, Moriam van Opstal, "The Sin Upon My Head," Shakespeare's Henry V in the Book of Joshua. Opstal argues that this phrase comes from the Book of Joshua, and it is Joshua chapter 2, verse 19. These Hebrew spies who are hiding out with Rahab, saying, "It shall be that whosoever shall go out of the doors of thy house into the street, his blood shall be upon his head, and we will be guiltless. And whosoever shall be with thee in the house, his blood shall be on our head, if any hand be upon him." So this notion of blood being on your hands does seem to be a reference to the Book of Joshua, which has a lot of resonances with Henry V if you talk about conquering resistant cities. Anyway, so you see in the first act, then Henry's strategy, threaten the church, get them to help sanctify his kingship, and above all, sanctify the war he wants to have with France. Now, quickly, the second act is devoted to getting his house in order, and he has this beginning conspiracy against him. As I mentioned, he really, through his intelligence, knows what's happening, and he essentially traps these men into condemning themselves to death. And you see, basically, this is what he has to do: put his house, his domestic house, in order to be able to lead a successful war against France. Now, one of the aspects of this is getting the various nations in order. Even in the first act, the English are worried, if we commit our armies to France, the Scottish are going to rebel, as they always do. And so that's why we do get this material in the play of definitely seeing a Scotsman, a Welshman, and an Irishman. And they are key to the British success. And we see the tension among them. They are suspicious of each other. The Irish don't like the Welsh don't like the Scottish don't like the Irish, and so on. And Henry's very good at handling this. He emphasizes the fact that he's Welsh in order to get the Welsh behind him. And it turns out that that's why this rather anomalous position, Prince of Wales, it turns out was created to make the Welsh feel they had a stake in the English regime. We don't have the king, but we have the prince. I was surprised to discover that the Dauphin in France is exactly the same. that there used to be an independent region called the Dauphiné. Any of you cycling fans know it's the preliminary race to the Tour de France is the so-called Dauphiné, but the Dauphiné was not part of France in the Middle Ages, and the reason they called their prince the Dauphin was to placate the Dauphinese, or whatever you call those people. I learned this on a river cruise on the road when you actually go to this region. But it is part of Henry's genius to make sure the various nationalities respect each other. And in particular, he seems to be reliant on certain of these nationalities to give him the kind of soldiers he needs. And this I noticed in Act 3, Scene 2, with the marvelous character of McMorris, the Irishman. I assume we were meant to do these figures with accents, but I'm not going to try an Irish accent here. But McMorris, who's very testy with the Welshman and vice versa. By Christ's law, 'tis ill done. The workers give o'er, the trumpets sound their treat. By my hand, I swear, my father's soul, the work is ill done. It is give over. I would have blown up the town, so Christ save me. Now, only Shakespeare can write a line like that. I would have blown up the town, so Christ save me. I've never seen anyone who's noticed the anomaly of this line. But it is the idea that McMorris's Christianity is at most skin deep. Deep down, he's a warrior. And what he likes doing is blowing up towns. And he doesn't like giving up, he doesn't like retreating. And you need people like McMorris if you're going to win battles. And so it's fortunate for Henry that he's got some really pagan subjects among his Christian Irishmen. And again, this is very interesting, the extent to which the British Army over the centuries relied on its Irish soldiers and its Scottish soldiers to fight its battles for them. Rudyard Kipling was very aware of this and portrays it in his stories set in India. And of course, these are the Irish and the Scotch are the people who settled Appalachia. And I believe they have yielded something like 60% of all the Congressional Medal of Honor winners in the US Army over the years. These mountain folk, I'm not too far, I'm only about 20 minutes away from them here in Charlottesville. They win wars for you. And it's a really interesting touch that Shakespeare gives us here, the kind of pagan ferocity of this Irishman. And Henry's going to draw upon that in his battles. And so it's one of his great successes that he mediates the conflict among the nationalities that go to comprise Great Britain. This whole scene I just referred, what is my nation? These people are very indignant about being told that they're from a different nation. And Henry's strategy is to create a Great Britain out of them, a United Kingdom, using their war against the French to do that. Now, in terms of the battle, Henry, we see how he goes among his troops the night before. We see the French the night before, they're all posing as chevaliers, these great knights. They're all talking about their horses and their mistresses, and sometimes they can't tell them apart. But Henry is leading a civilian army. This battle, actually, Agincourt is a very famous battle in military history. In a way, it marked the end of medieval warfare. Medieval warfare had been based on knights. The famous knights in shining armor, mounted horsemen, were unstoppable. They were like tanks. And you won a battle by having all the great knights on your side. And everything in this play, in all the scenes with the French, suggests that they are absolutely certain they're going to win because of that. If any of you know the history of Agincourt, it marked a major change in military technology. There's a very good essay on it in John Keegan's book, The Face of Battle. Keegan, one of the best military historians. What Henry did was use his yeoman artillery, in effect, the archers, his yeoman archers, to defeat the French knights. What the British had developed in the course of the 100 Years' War was armor-piercing arrows, which meant they developed longbows. Evidently, they depended upon the yew trees, Y-E-W, in England, from which you could make a bow that could shoot armor-piercing arrows. It's not so much that the arrows were armor-piercing, is that the bows could deliver an armor-piercing arrow. And what Henry did was create a killing zone for the French cavalry. He entrenched a position, put thousands of archers behind it, and the French just got mowed down. That's how Henry was able to win at such a numerical disadvantage, and why the casualty figures are so unbalanced, with thousands of Frenchmen being killed and just a handful of English being killed. It would be like the use of machine guns in World War I, another turning point in military technological history. This is the great achievement that Henry made, and why he won this battle. You would never know this from Shakespeare's play, however. You would know it from Kenneth Branagh's film, for example. I think even Olivier's film. This is so famous about Agincourt. I can't stress how famous this is, the invention of this military stratagem that made this English victory possible. And it's all in Shakespeare's source in Holland's Head, but it's not in Shakespeare's play. And in fact, Henry insists no stratagem. This is in Act 4, Scene 8, when they've just gone down the incredible numbers of how many the French have been killed, now few English. One of the articles I referred to refers to the casualty figures at the Battle of Ai in Book of Joshua, and they're similarly disproportionate. But Henry says, none else of name and of all other men but 5 and 20. O God, thy arm was here, and not to us, but to thy arm alone ascribe we all, when without stratagem, but in plain shock and even play of battle, was ever known so great and little loss on one part and the other. Take it, God, for it is none but thine. This, as my sources have shown me, is a reference to Psalm 44, verse 3. For they got not the land in possession by their own sword, neither did their own arm save them, but thy right hand and thine arm and the light of thy countenance, because thou hadst a favor unto them. The Psalms, of course, give God the credit for Israel's great battles in the land of Canaan. And this image of, not our arm, oh God, thy arm was here. And it's amazing how Shakespeare to say that this battle didn't involve stratagem. It was like, saying we didn't win World War II against the Japanese with the atomic bomb, or you talked about the end of World War II without mentioning the atomic bomb. And this is Henry's effort to make the victory seem divine, and therefore transform this into a holy war. And just at the end of this Act 4, Scene 8, Henry says, do we all holy rites, let there be sung non nobis, and Te Deum, the dead with charity and clothes and clay, and then to Calais and to England then, where an heir from France arrived more happy men. Now, this is in Shakespeare's source. It's quite explicit in Holinshead's Chronicle, his account of this battle, that Henry had them sing Non Nobis and Te Deum. Now, Non Nobis is a reference to the 115th Psalm. It's the opening of the 115th Psalm. Not unto us, O Lord, and not unto us. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto thy name give glory for thy mercy and for the truth's sake. And this is a sequence of Psalms that deal with Moses leading the Hebrews out of Egypt. And the Bible gives credit to the Lord for this. And indeed, there's a whole sequence of Psalms here, which form part of the Haggadah and are remembered at Passover. And Psalm 114 begins famously, when Israel went out of Egypt, the house of Jacob for a people of strange language, Judah was a sanctuary, and Israel his dominion. The sea saw it and fled, Jordan was driven back, and so on. It's a great celebration of God's might. And you can see what Shakespeare is showing Henry appropriating here, that he is trying to cast himself on the model of Moses, also of Joshua, perhaps King David as well, of a ruler who battles on behalf of a God who supports him in the field. And indeed, when Henry has this moment of soliloquy, when he addresses God, he addresses him as, O God of battles, which is not the most Christian conception of God in the Bible. It's much closer to an Old Testament conception. And in fact, one of these authors I was reading looks at the St. Crispin's Day speech, Henry's famous St. Crispin's Day speech, as a kind of setting up of a Passover ceremony. That is, ahead of time, Henry is trying to rally his troops, give them hope. And the way he does it is to say, look at how you look back on this glorious event. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall see this day and live old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors, the Passover feast, and say, tomorrow is St. Crispian. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Christmas Day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups, freshly remembered. The story shall the good man teach his son. Remember that from Passover? He's trying to create a ritual here. We will remember this day. We will celebrate it with a feast. We will all participate in it. And so you really see here what Henry's hopes are. Many of Shakespeare's kings and leaders would not be so humble with a victory like this. Many of them would be speaking proudly of what they did. Shakespeare's Coriolanus says, alone I did it. It's true that if you read your annals true, I fluttered your Volskis and Coriolanus, alone I did it. Coriolanus doesn't ascribe the victory to Mars. He's a very proud Roman. But Henry understands the advantage. Now, I really do see this as a political act on his part. I do not see this as a great act of piety. on his part. It's a very useful piety, let me put it that way. He wants the appearance of piety. And above all, he wants to present it as a miracle. It's very interesting that at the opening of the play, Shakespeare rather strangely has a couple of Catholics say the age of miracles is over. This is in Act 1, Scene 1, about line 66. It must be so, for miracles are ceased. It's a Protestant doctrine, not a Catholic doctrine. But it's very much Henry's strategy to present himself as the beneficiary of a miracle. Again, he won this battle because of brilliant strategy and tactics. But he'd like the victory to seem miraculous. The casualty figures, the lopsided nature of the casualty figures make it look miraculous. Explaining it in terms of armor-piercing longbows doesn't sound so miraculous anymore. So Henry conceals that because he really would like to get that sacred aura around his kingship again, that he was a miraculous victor. Now, I worry a bit about denying piety of this man, so I will conclude by talking about, there's so much to talk about this play, but maybe we can get to other things in the question period, but I will talk about the notorious example of the execution of the French prisoners in the play. Again, this is very much discussed in accounts of the play. Henry gets a great advantage at the beginning of the play, at the beginning of the battle, and he's winning, and they take a lot of prisoners. Remember, in these kind of battles, once a knight was dislodged from his horse, he was helpless. The armor weighed so much, and that was Henry's great hope here. But Henry ends up in a situation where he has more French prisoners than he has soldiers in his own army. And when the battlefield situation seems to reverse itself, he gives the order to execute the French prisoners. This is in Act 4, Scene 6, about line 35. When we get a rather tender moment, he's weeping at what he's seeing in the battle. I blame you not. For hearing this, I must perforce compound with blissful eyes, or they will issue too. But hark! What new alarm is the same. The French have reinforced their scattered men. Then every soldier kill his prisoners. This was very controversial at the time. It is still controversial in the history books. Keegan discusses it at some length in his book, Face of Battle. Let me assure you that this was a no-no. I mean, obviously it's against the Geneva Convention, and we still we frown upon executing prisoners. It is a war crime in our world. And maybe you say, oh, Middle Ages, big deal. But no, chivalry. This was warfare governed by the code of chivalry. These were wars fought by knights and therefore governed by chivalry. It was far worse than, if possible, to execute prisoners, especially noble prisoners. And we all know why there's a prohibition against executing prisoners. They're helpless, and moreover, who's going to ever surrender if they might get executed? So it's almost a basic law of warfare not to kill prisoners. But things happen in war that you can't anticipate, and when for Henry it's the choice of losing his whole army and France and everything, or execute the prisoners, he does choose to execute the prisoners. So there, for all the piety in Henry and his appearance of piety, there's something very Machiavellian about him. But there's an even stranger twist to this. and that is just in the next scene, Henry reorders the execution of the French prisoners. It's so strange. This is end of Act 4, Scene 7. I was not angry since I came to France until the citizens. Take a trumpet, herald, ride thou unto the horsemen on yon hill. If they will fight with us, bid them come down, roar the field. They do offend our sight. Or void the field, they do offend. If they do neither, we will come to them and make them scur away as swift as stones and force from the old Assyrian slings. Besides, we'll cut the throats of those we have, and on a man of them we shall taste our mercy. He just ordered this in the preceding scene, and now he's saying, we'll cut the throats of those we have. This is one of those strange things that happens in Shakespeare. It's like the double revelation of Portia's death in Act 4, Julius Caesar. What Henry is doing here is seizing upon an opportunity to make himself look better. What has just happened is after he gave the order to execute the French prisoners, the French have attacked the baggage train of the English army and killed a lot of innocent boys in a result. And Henry now presents the order to kill the French prisoners as a reaction to that. Just one scene earlier, it's in effect spontaneous. Henry takes the move, but here, I really think he seizes the opportunity to make himself look better. And in the confusion of war, this is the sort of thing that happens and gets debated endlessly in military history. Who did what, when, and who did this first, and so on, who attacked first, and so on. Now, in a way, this makes Henry look worse here, that he's trying to conceal what he did. But I'm going to make an argument that it actually is better, that Henry is trying to put the best face on what's happened. Yes, in the absolute extremist of circumstances, he was forced to violate a fundamental rule of war and execute the prisoners. But Henry doesn't brag about it. You can imagine characters such as Richard III in Shakespeare who would. And that's when you really have a problem when someone, in effect, exalts and exults in necessity, because what you don't want is for people to resort to necessity too easily. You really want it to be a last resort. And if you proclaim it and say, yeah, I killed the French with no provocation, I had to do it, that's going to make it too easy the next time to do it. So it's actually, in a sense, a great public relations coup on Henry's part here to present it as better than what he actually did. And again, he does not glory in the evil things he's done the way, again, characters like Richard III or Iago or Edmund and King Lear do. Shakespeare always shows about evil figures that they delight too much in their evil. And I'd say here, Henry, for one moment, does something truly evil and violating the law of prisoners, and yet he's trying to mitigate it. And it says something about his whole policy. He learned Machiavellianism from his father. His father did execute a legitimate king, suffered for it. Henry's trying to avoid that fate himself. And so everything he does in this play is to give legitimacy to his kingship again, so that even when he has to do something that is way outside the decent command in battle, he does everything to cover it over and make his actions seem to be those of a pious king. And that's the toughness of Shakespeare, that he doesn't think a king can be simply a goody-goody. Actually, when he portrays Henry's son, Henry VI, which he'd done in earlier plays. Henry VI's rule is disastrous because he comes to the throne as a child and he's basically too nice and can't do the nasty things a king sometimes has to do. But the point about Henry V is he doesn't want the nastiness to become the norm. And there is a way to do that by carefully covering over the nastiness and stressing his piety and his fundamental decency in conducting the war. I mean, with Harfleur, for example, he threatens it to get the city to surrender. Who knows what he would have done if it hadn't surrendered? It would have been pretty nasty if he'd had to take the city by force. By the way, one of the essays I was talking about shows that the rules by which Henry conducts a siege are exactly the same as are outlined in the book of Deuteronomy. So again, there's all these signs that Henry is adopting Old Testament kingship as one of his guidelines. And Old Testament kingship can get pretty tough at times. Again, these people were in a situation where their lives were at stake. So I'll stop here. Happy to take questions, comments.
All right, thank you very much. Baruch Lev, why don't you lead us off?
Professor, you alluded to the dichotomy between England's almost rustic democratic forces with the king who intermingles with the soldiers, and France, which is more aristocratic. Do you make anything of the fact that when Shakespeare is writing, England is actually emerging slowly as a superpower, an imperial power? Is this maybe a critique on what's happening in England, or?
No, because I think Shakespeare understood that the key to the English kingship was going to be the support of the common people. And it's if we were doing Henry IV Part 1, I could show this, that the key to Henry is that he understands his common people. Yes, England became an imperial power, but it became an imperial power because it was able to draw upon the energies of its common people in a way that, the French weren't quite as good as that. I mean, I have to go into a whole theory I have here that Shakespeare wanted the English monarchy to be modeled on the Roman Republic, that he actually wanted England to have a mixed regime with a monarchic, an aristocratic, and a democratic element. Montesquieu in the 18th century said that England was a monarchy masquerading, was a republic masquerading as a monarchy. And that's really true, and it's why, England still has a king and France hasn't had one for a couple of centuries. And so I think Shakespeare understood that the monarchy, the Tudor monarchy, and especially under Elizabeth, had a lot of popular support. Now, there were nasty aspects even to Elizabeth's regime, and there was a lot of espionage going on, and people today argue that Elizabeth's court was a kind of police state. I think that exaggerates things. But if you compare French history with English history, what the English monarchy managed to do was enlist the people on its side. The institution of Parliament had a lot to do with that. If you look at the difference between Parliament and the Estates General in France, you can see a huge difference there. And in general, the English monarchy proved more porous to the middle class than the French did. And you see it a lot in Henry VIII, who used these church lands to take middle class people, mainly merchants, and make them nobles. It was a complaint of a lot of the nobility in Elizabeth's court about this, that, they were forced to mingle with tailors and merchants. A guy who was Henry VIII's tailor was suddenly a noble. But that proved to be the genius of the English monarchy and its ability to mobilize especially the energy of its middle class. Now, the French did that to some extent. But for example, the total failure of the Spanish monarchy, which remained in the hands of the nobility and never marshaled the middle class forces in Spain. Spain looked to be the most powerful nation in Europe around 1650 years later. It was nothing already. And again, I don't want to underestimate the power of the middle class. In France, they eventually, in effect, accomplished the French Revolution, but still, by comparison, I think the popular element in the English regime gave it a lot of the very energy it manifested, even its imperial divisions. And, remember, by the middle of the 17th century, they deposed the king and beheaded him, and then by the end of the century, in 1688, they chose the House of Orange over the House of Stuart, and so I don't know how much Shakespeare played a role in this. I think if he was trying to teach English monarchs anything in his history plays, it was pay attention to the people, even if it's Machiavellian. Pay attention to them, make them think you care about them, talk to them, understand them, give them a role in the regime. That's everything that Henry's doing in this play. And the French are really stuck-up aristocrats in the play, and they pay for it in the battle when English yeomen, bowmen mow them down.
Thank you.
Yehuda.
Professor, earlier in your talk, you mentioned the motivation behind Henry V as Prince Hal, associating with the likes of Falstaff and his associates as being sort of learning how to work with the common people. And I'm just sort of curious, if this is indeed his motivation, why choose a group of individuals and associates who he will eventually have to turn away in such a significant way in earlier and to the extent in this play that Falstaff, some people claim that's why he died, and he has to execute one of them. Why choose people who he will have to turn away from, as opposed to choosing people who he talks to after the Battle of Agincourt, for example, who seem to be sort of noble Welshmen or Irishmen or people who are good people?
Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. If you're going to rule England, you're going to have to deal with people like Falstaff and Bardolph and Nym and Pistol. One of the signs of the failure of Henry IV's regime is that highwaymen are out on the roads in England, and people are not safe in their beds. They cannot sleep in an inn without being robbed. And so Henry can learn a lot by dealing with criminals. And indeed, as we see, he eventually hauls him off to jail, has him executed. But one of the problems a king faces, and this is a central problem Shakespeare portrays, is getting the truth about his subjects, because people will lie to the king. They won't be honest with him. They don't want him to see that, for example, they're criminals. In a sense, Henry lulls all the criminal element in England to sleep. They start to feel comfortable with him. They think he's a bit of a criminal himself. They think they can exploit him when he comes to the throne. And in a way, he gets all these plots out. He makes it clear who he's going to have to deal with when he becomes king. And again, it's like the Godfather. He just settles all his scores when he comes to the throne, takes care of them all at once. And so that's, again, I think you would see it as a Machiavellian point, that you think you should learn from all the good people in your realm in order to be a good king, but the good people are not going to be your main problem. The criminals are going to be your problem. And so there's a lot to be said for Henry learning where the threats are. He is so subject to flattery at the court that in a way the flattery in Eastcheap is so blatant Falstaff thinks he's so smart, and yet Henry can see right through him. People always talk about how, oh, it's such a shock when Falstaff gets banished at the end of Henry IV Part 2. Well, in the middle of Henry IV Part 1, Hal announces it when he's playing his father with the banished Jack Falstaff. I will. In a way, he doesn't disguise this from Falstaff, but he's learning a lot about human nature and not the pretty side of human nature. And that's going to be very basic to him as a king.
Noam.
Yeah, so you were talking about how obviously there's this tension between King Henry uses religious rhetoric, but of course he also undermines the church, and he threatens them at the beginning of the play, of course. So, what was Shakespeare's vision for Britain? Was it going to be modeled on a biblical nation, like ancient Israel, where the country was united in their religion, or was it supposed to be, you mentioned Rome, like was it more supposed to be a civic country where religion serves the political and we don't unite around religion? Which one was it? Because he's still using religious rhetoric, as you know.
I don't think it's an either-or situation. I do think that what Shakespeare was looking for was a civic community on the model of the Roman Republic, but with a veneer of a religious basis. And Shakespeare's in a situation where there are certain facts, and one of them is Christianity. And so you're never going back to Rome when you're in a Christian world. But there are these Christian alternatives, Catholicism and Protestantism, and I believe Shakespeare significantly preferred Protestantism, and saw that what Henry VIII and now Queen Elizabeth were pursuing was a national church, and where people could be loyal to their country now through their religion, where the Catholic Church was not a fifth column within England, often siphoning off the loyalty of the English people. And indeed, when popes would excommunicate a ruler, it was canceling their loyalty to their king or queen, and the popes did that with Protestant England. So I think Shakespeare thought the real hope was something on the model of the Roman regime. And again, the famous mixed regime now, where you'd have a monarchic, an aristocratic, and a democratic element in the regime, roughly through the king, House of Lords, and House of Commons. But this would necessarily be in a Christian setting, and where the religion could never quite be a civic religion in the sense that Rome had. You're not going to have specifically English gods. So the compromise was a Church of England, where, for example, the bishops and the archbishops would be appointed by the king and not the Pope. And I think that Shakespeare thought it would help the English regime if it had a kind of religious grounding. And he looked back to the Old Testament and saw the power of that in the history of ancient Israel. Now, again, so I was joking with Neil, I'm not going to claim that Shakespeare was Jewish, and that we can see in Shakespeare a longing to return to the age of the Old Testament. Nevertheless, I think he did see certain principles in the Old Testament that could be revived. And it's what Machiavelli does when he holds up Moses as one of the examples of the great princes. Machiavelli was not a religious man, but still thought he could learn things from the Bible. And indeed, you read the book of Joshua, there's a lot of, I was just rereading it, there's a lot of military lessons in that, that I think Shakespeare in effect translates into the actions of Henry V.
Others, Ruben.
So you speak about this, I guess, conversation between the political and theological of King Henry, but then at the end of the play, the last scene is a big romantic plea. Where does that tie into the major story, and why does Shakespeare choose to end off with this scene?
Okay, I mean the fifth act shows the ultimate hope of Henry, that he could unite the French and English. And again, that's not so implausible, since the royal family of England was French in origins. Again, never forget the Norman conquest. And notice that his hope is a crusade, a real crusade, that at the end of the play with Catherine, he's hoping that they can have a son who will go off and retake Constantinople. Shall not thou and I, between Saint Denis and Saint George, compound a boy half French, half English, that shall go to Constantinople and take the Turk by the beard. This is funny because this is taking place in 1415, and Constantinople did not fall till 1453. But it shows real, we can go have a real crusade here. I was actually quite surprised. I visited Bodrum in Turkey once. It's ancient Halicarnassus, so the tomb of King Marcellus is there, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. But there's a gigantic Crusader castle dedicated to St. John. And on the very top of it is an English tower. And on it are the arms of the House of Lancaster. I could not believe it. Henry IV had contributed to building that Crusader castle. I mean, I always thought this stuff of Henry IV wanting to go on a crusade was just pie in the sky, castles in Spain, but it was real. He'd actually sent money to contribute to the cause of crusades. This is sort of like the Knights Templar. And it's just real. I saw a couple from England. I said, look at that. That's the coat of arms of Henry IV. So in a sense, Shakespeare is having some hopes here for Henry. And of course, the point is that Henry can, he's united Britain, and now his hope is that he will unite England and France into a greater nation. Now, it did not happen. There are lots of reasons why it didn't happen, but Shakespeare wanted to at least suggest the possibility, knowing full well that it fell apart in the next generation, that under Henry VI, the British lost all their claims to land in France. Now, dramatically, Shakespeare wants this play to have a happy ending. Indeed, it fills out a sequence of 4 plays. Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, Henry V, that Shakespeare wants to give a happy ending to. In a sense, he'd like a comedy here, not a tragedy. He doesn't want this play to end with the death of Henry V, though it foreshadows it. So to have a comic ending, you need a marriage. And this last sequence is actually very funny. And it gives Shakespeare what he wants, a happy ending to this very difficult period in English history, to the one happy moment, Henry's great triumph at Agincourt. I'd also say it's an attempt to make us forget the murder of the French prisoners. It's a very difficult moment. Shakespeare doesn't shy away from it, he shows it. And indeed, I think he dwells upon it by having that double order that Henry gives. But Shakespeare would like us to go home from the theater whistling a happy tune. It's like the Merchant of Venice, where Act 4 is really overwhelming and so gut-wrenching with what happens with Shylock and to Shylock. And that scene. There's Shakespeare, in one of his weightiest plays, and perhaps the weightiest of his comedies, makes Act 5 total fluff in Merchant of Venice. Begins with some incredible lyrical stuff about famous lovers in antiquity, and essentially nothing happens in Act 5 because Shakespeare wants us to forget Shylock. And doesn't want us to come home dealing with what serious issues he's raised in Act 4. He's got a comedy. It's very hard to get from Act 4 of Merchant of Venice to a comedy. And so Shakespeare creates a very unusual Act 5 there, and I think he's doing something similar here. As for the hopes of uniting France and England, they've already been dashed in Act 3, Scene 4, where we see that deep down the French and the English really can't communicate. Act 3, Scene 4 is just unprecedented in the history of drama. It's as if Star Trek, Kirk arrived on another planet and they didn't speak English. They spoke Klingon or whatever. You know, the absurd convention of all world drama is that the characters of the play speak the language of the audience, not of their own land. Aeschylus's Persians speak Greek, for example. It all began there, blame it on Aeschylus. But Shakespeare gives us a scene in French. And why? It's very interesting. In terms of plot, it shows that the French are not so confident, that they're already anticipating having to make a deal with the French, so they're letting the princess learn English. But it's deeper than that. That scene works on the stage. When you read it, you may doubt that. But I've never seen it fail to work on stage because it is a language lesson. And we can see the characters translating the passage for us. When you mention the neck, you get the French word for neck, and then you point to the neck and give the English word neck. And what it does suggest is that human beings are united, but only on the level of the body. We have the same bodies. We all have necks, we all have feet, and we all have hands. And so it's the easiest form of translation, and it always works. But the problem is we're only united in bodily things. By the way, Shylock makes the same point when he says, hath not a Jew hands? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? Jews and Christians don't laugh at the same jokes, but they both react with their bodies. If you tickle, they laugh. And here, things go haywire with certain words. And they are words that have moral connotations. Like Catherine mistakes chin for sin. And above all, the four-letter words get screwed up in translation, that the English word for foot and the English word for gown turn out to sound just like the two principal four-letter words in French. And so she's shocked. So languages translate on the level of the body, but on the level of morals and ethics and sensibilities, they don't translate. And we've already seen it's hard enough for Henry to unite Britain when he's got four peoples who speak English with different accents. Whether he's ever going to be able to unite the English and the French speaking two different languages, I think Shakespeare raises grave doubts about that in his central. By the way, it's the central scene of the play. If you count by act, it's the central scene of the central act, and so Shakespeare, well, he already knows it's not going to work. So although he tries to show it as the happy ending to the story, he's already undermined it. And of course, the last words about how Henry VI's rule is going to be a disaster. That reminds us that Shakespeare's already portrayed that earlier in his career with the 3 Henry VI plays of Richard III. So the fifth act's very important. I omitted it solely for reasons of time, and I was hoping we'd bring it up here in the after time and post-season, whatever you call this. Overtime, it's an overtime.
Anyone else? Got time for one or two more quick ones.
Ezra?
Yeah, hi, Professor. Thank you so much. I was just curious, you mentioned how King Henry tries to downplay the strategy that he uses in his wars in order to emphasize the miraculous nature of it and God's involvement in it. So I was curious whether you think Shakespeare in general views, I guess, human strategy and human military strategy and human intuition and creativity as contradictory to God's intervention, and whether those things are really, whether Shakespeare views those as contradictions, or I guess we would say maybe the more Jewish view as that it's possible that human strategy and human intuition is attributable to God itself, and that it wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't have to downplay the military strategy in order to attribute the war to miraculous act of God.
Yeah, I mean, that option's always open. I do think that Shakespeare believed in human agency. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. But one of the things Shakespeare portrays in his Roman plays is the gradual undermining of the sense of human agency as the political community gets larger and larger and the rulers become more distant from the people. I do think that Shakespeare believed that politics was a realm of human agency and that people win battles because of stratagems and because of courage and things like that. Given your view of the world, you could easily see that as compatible with divine a divine role in human affairs. But the basic, the distinction between a miracle and a divinely inspired stratagem, I mean, I think that's something people do understand. And I think Henry's looking to stage miracles. In Henry IV, Part 1, he reveals after the first scene that he is, the second scene, that he's going to stage a reformation. It's going to look so much better if he seems to be a bum and then emerges as a good king than if he's a goody-goody as a child and then becomes a good king. He really likes to make a big splash and exploit the kind of publicity value of that. But again, what you say, depending upon your view of the world, I mean, if God's responsible for everything, he's also responsible for human ingenuity.
So you mentioned Machiavelli. The name has come up quite a lot in this discussion, I think rightly so. But doesn't this act of humility, which you've mentioned, which seems whether it's from a political point of view or whatever its origins, it does create a certain kind of rapprochement with more classical models of ideal kingship, right? The fact that, Machiavelli's princes are always bragging of their cruelty. For political effect, it's true to, so the fact they won't have to be cruel later on, maybe, but they're still bragging of it, right? Whereas in, Aristotle or, people who are aligned with Aristotle, they don't have a view that, they don't have a naive view or a king never has to do and make any tough choices or whatever, but they do, how it's framed afterwards is, that humility or for the sake of the common good, et cetera, is brought back in. So, I mean, is there sort of a classical side to this portrait of kingship as well?
Oh, absolutely. That's why I evoked the Roman mixed regime. That much of this, I think, is modeled on Shakespeare's understanding of the Roman mixed regime. And he was trying, in effect, to slip in a republic to England through the back door. But indeed, what is it? Hypocrisy is the complement vice pays to virtue. That Shakespeare worries when a Machiavellian is too open about his Machiavellianism. And that's what you see, for example, in Richard III, that he's much more interested in a king who will do what's necessary when it's necessary, but he would fight very hard to keep a line between necessary goods and necessary evils. And that requires a certain kind of rhetoric. Very struck by Winston Churchill in this regard. It's very strange that Churchill did everything he could to conceal the extent of British espionage during World War II. The British were truly the masters of espionage in World War II, and may well have been most responsible for winning the war because of their breakthrough, like breaking the German Enigma code and so on. And as you may know, breaking the Enigma code depended upon creating the first computer, first large-scale computer done with the help of Alan Turing in England. In a monumental economic era, Churchill decided to dismantle that computer and do nothing further with it. It's debatable, but at the end of World War II, England was arguably as advanced as the United States in computing, and might have come to dominate the computing industry instead of the United States. But Churchill didn't want to advertise that. Part of it was he didn't want enemies to know in future wars that England had this capability, because at the end of World War II, the Germans still didn't know we had broken the Enigma code. Von Rundstedt suspected it, but nobody else in Germany. In a way, it was a military decision, but also I don't think he wanted to reveal how Machiavellian the British had been. What has come out about their intelligence operations is just spectacular. All the disinformation they created, all the misdirection they created. And Churchill was as Machiavellian as they get, but he's also had the facade of an English gentleman. After all, he's from the Marlborough family. And the British never bragged about their espionage capabilities. And so that would be an example of what we're talking about here, that certain kind of decency in basic life makes you reticent to admit when you've done ungentlemanly things, as for example, the British did throughout World War II, including having the biggest spying operation on the United States of any foreign country during World War II. So anyway, I think there's a very important classical element in Shakespeare. And then reading Aristotle's Politics can teach you an awful lot about what's going on in Shakespeare, but also Roman history.
All right. Well, I think I think we're out of time. It's a good note to end on. I mean, guys, it's just had so much. And luckily, we're going to spend another week at least with this play so we can unpack many of the themes which you've addressed this ening. And just we're incredibly grateful for sharing your wisdom and insight about Shakespeare and many other things aside, and in the context of political thought and religion and Bible as well. I mean, just so exceptionally rich and helpful. So if everyone could join me giving a digital Zoom round of applause for Professor Cantor. And thank you so much for joining us. It's a shame. We would have liked to have shown you around campus, including the study hall, where normally at this time, 8:30 at night, people would be, huddled over their books and study rather than watching a football game or whatever. It's a great advantage of learning being carried forward, but perhaps on a subsequent visit.
I really love. I mean, look, I miss The Simpsons to do this. Fortunately, we live in the age of DVRs, and I'll just go down and watch it now. But I understand we all make sacrifices. But again, it's just I like Zoom, and it seems to work well. I really felt that this had the intimacy of a conversation. I enjoyed it very much. But yeah, it's really sad that I can't be there. And maybe someday we can work it out so I can be. I would feel very much at home amongst you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, and we'll convene again this time next week.
Good luck to all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.